The year was 2347. Humanity had spent centuries reaching for the stars. Satellites, probes, and deep space telescopes, all of it pointed outward, scanning the endless black ocean of space for any sign that someone else was out there. Scientists had debated for generations. Philosophers had written books. Children had grown up staring at the night sky, whispering the same quiet question into the dark. Are we alone? And then, on a cold Tuesday morning in November, the answer arrived. Dr. Sarah Connell was sitting in her office at the Global Deep Space Monitoring Station in Denver, Colorado. She was 38 years old, sharp-eyed, with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun and a coffee cup that had been empty for 2 hours. She had not noticed. She was too busy staring at the screen in front of her, reading the same line of data over and over again, certain that her eyes were playing tricks on her. The signal was not random noise. It was not a pulsar. It was not interference from a satellite. It was structured. It was deliberate. And it was coming from deep space, from a region of the galaxy that no human probe had ever reached. Sarah picked up her phone and called her director, Dr. Marcus Webb. Marcus, she said, her voice completely flat. You need to come to my office right now. Sarah, it is 6 in the morning. Marcus. She paused. The signal is real. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then the sound of footsteps already moving. Within 40 minutes, the entire senior staff of the station was crowded around Sarah's workstation. Nobody spoke. The signal played on loop through the speakers. A low, rhythmic pattern of pulses and tones that felt almost musical, like something ancient being sung through the stars. Dr. Leo Park, the station's lead linguist, leaned in close to the speaker. He was a quiet man in his 50s, always calm, always measured. But today his hands were trembling. It is a greeting, he said softly. Everyone turned to look at him. How can you possibly know that? Marcus asked. Leo pointed at the waveform on the screen. Because I have seen this pattern before. He straightened up slowly, his face pale. This exact pattern. In an archive. A classified archive. He looked around at the faces staring at him. One that I was never supposed to access. The room went hushed. Sarah set down her empty coffee cup. Leo, she said carefully. What archive? Leo looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the signal still pulsing on the screen. And when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. The one that proves, he said, that this is not the first time they have contacted us. Nobody slept that night. By midnight, Marcus had made 3 phone calls, one to the United Nations Space Authority, one to a number Sarah did not recognize, and one that he stepped outside to make, standing alone in the cold parking lot for 20 minutes while everyone inside watched him through the glass. When he came back in, his face was unreadable. The station is under communication lockdown effective immediately, he said. Nobody contacts the outside world until further notice. There were protests. Dr. James Fowler, the youngest researcher on the team, slammed his hand on the table. You cannot lock us down over a signal. This is the biggest discovery in human history. Sit down, James, Marcus said quietly. Not frustrated. Not cold. Just very grave. Please. Something in his tone made James sit. Sarah watched Marcus carefully. She had worked with this man for 11 years. She knew every expression on his face. And the expression he was wearing right now was one she had never seen before. It was not excitement. It was not caution. It was something much older than either of those things. It was the expression of a man who already knew. Marcus, she said. Talk to us. He sat down heavily in a chair. He looked at the signal still playing on the loop. Then he looked at Leo Park, who had not moved from his spot near the speaker. How much did you see in that archive? Marcus asked him. Leo was quiet for a moment. Enough, he said. Then you know I cannot explain everything tonight. No, Leo agreed. But you can explain one thing. Marcus waited. Why? Leo said slowly. Does that signal contain coordinates? He turned to the screen and pointed at a specific section of the waveform. Right there. Embedded in the 3rd sequence. Those are spatial coordinates. And they are not pointing at the source of the signal. He turned back to Marcus. They are pointing at Earth. The room was absolutely still. Sarah felt something cold move through her. Not fear exactly. Something deeper than fear. The feeling you get when a door opens that you did not know was there, and on the other side of it the dark goes down a very long way. Marcus, she said. Those coordinates. How old are they? Marcus looked at her. And this time he did not look away. The earliest record we have, he said quietly, is from 14,000 years ago. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. But we believe the original transmission is much, much older than that. James Fowler's voice sounded as if someone had knocked the air out of him. Sarah did not make any sound at all. She just stared at Marcus and thought about all the things she believed she knew about him, feeling them quietly begin to shift beneath her feet. "They have been watching us," she said. It was not a question. Marcus nodded once. "For how long?" He was quiet for a very long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the empty parking lot. The signal pulsed on and on through the speaker, low, ancient, and patient. "Since before we could walk upright," he said. By morning, 3 black vehicles had arrived at the station. They parked in a neat row outside the main entrance, and 6 people in dark coats walked in without knocking. They did not show identification. Furthermore, they did not smile. The one in front, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and calm gray eyes, simply walked to the center of the room and looked at everyone assembled there. "My name is Director Yates," she said. "I am here on behalf of the Global Continuity Council. And I need all of you to understand something clearly before we go any further." She paused and looked at each face in turn. "What you have discovered in the last 12 hours is not new." Sarah felt the words land like something heavy dropped onto the floor. "How long has this council known?" she asked. Director Yates looked at her without blinking. "The council itself has existed in various forms for approximately 300 years. But the knowledge it protects is considerably older." She opened a briefcase and placed a single hard drive on the table. Then she placed her hand flat on top of it. In 1947, a recovery operation in New Mexico uncovered physical evidence of non-human intelligence. That much has leaked into public knowledge over the decades. What has not leaked, she said, is what was found inside the recovered object. She lifted her hand from the drive. A message, encoded in a mathematical language. And at the center of that message was a single instruction. Nobody in the room moved. The instruction, Director Yates continued, was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was a request. She looked at the hard drive. It said, "Do not respond to the signal until the species is ready." Leo Park let out a long, slow breath. "They asked us not to answer." "Yes." "Which means," Sarah said slowly, working it through, "they knew we would eventually receive a signal." "They planned it," Leo said, turning to look at her. His voice was quiet, but his eyes were alive with something electric. "They have been sending signals to Earth on a schedule. A very long schedule. Thousands of years between transmissions." He turned to Director Yates. "The signal that came in last night, this is not the first one. It is just the first one that we were meant to answer." Director Yates looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Dr. Park, how did you access that archive?" Leo met her gaze calmly. "Does it matter?" Pause. "No," she said. "Not anymore." She pulled out a chair and sat down, and for the first time she looked like something other than a government official. She looked like a person carrying a very, very heavy thing for a very long time. "What matters," she said, "is that the response window is open. And it will only stay open for 72 hours. She looked around the room. "After that, based on everything we know about their transmission schedule, they will not send another signal for another 1,000 years. Silence. Then James Fowler said very quietly, "So we have to decide right now whether to answer." "Yes," said Director Yates. "And if we answer," Sarah said, "what happens?" Director Yates looked at her. And Sarah saw something move behind those calm gray eyes, something that looked, just for a second, like genuine uncertainty. "That," Director Yates said, "is the part we have never been able to predict." They spent the first 12 hours of those 72 reading. Director Yates had given them full access to the archive on the hard drive. It was enormous. Thousands of documents, audio recordings, photographic files, and video records, all of them classified, all of them collected over centuries by the Global Continuity Council and its predecessors. Sarah, Marcus, Leo, and James divided the files between them and read in near silence, stopping occasionally to share something that hit too hard to keep to themselves. What they found was not what Sarah had expected. She had expected evidence of alien contact. She got that. But she also got something she had not prepared herself for, evidence of human contact. Of people, across dozens of generations who had known about this. Who had carried this secret. Who had woken up every morning knowing that the stars were not empty and that the thing living in them was watching and had been watching since before the first human hand pressed itself into wet clay and left a mark on a cave wall. There were diaries. Some of them went back 400 years. Scientists, priests, military officers, astronomers, all of them writing in the dark, in private, about the thing they knew and could not say. About the weight of it. About the loneliness of it. About the strange, terrible privilege of being one of the few people alive who understood that humanity was not the only story being told in the universe. One entry, written by a French astronomer in 1743, stopped Sarah completely. She read it 3 times. The man had written, "I do not know whether they are kind or merely patient. I do not know if there is a difference. But I know the truth, they have given us time. More time than we perhaps deserved. And I find myself wondering, on nights when the sky is very clear, whether that alone is the answer to every question I have ever had about what it means to be loved." Sarah sat with that for a long moment. Then she kept reading. Leo had found something different. He came to her desk at hour 9, his face pale and his eyes very bright. "Sarah," he said, "look at this." He placed a translated document in front of her. It was a decoded section of the original 1947 message, the one Director Yates had referenced. Sarah read it carefully. Then she read it again. Then she looked up at Leo. "This is not an instruction," she said. "This is a story." "Yes," Leo said. She looked back at the document. The story described a species, not human, not from this solar system, that had discovered a small, young, loud, confused world full of creatures who fought each other constantly and burned their home and screamed into the void without understanding why. And instead of leaving, instead of moving on, this species had decided to wait. Had decided that the creatures on that small world were worth waiting for. Had posted the coordinates of that world in their own records as a place of, and here the translation got uncertain, the word used was something between sacred and promising, as a place worth returning to. And then they had set a clock. A very long clock. "They gave us a deadline," Sarah said. "Not exactly," Leo said. He pointed at the bottom of the document. "They gave us a threshold. If we had survived and grown enough, we would receive the signal designed to reach us. Not the earlier ones, those were tests. Probes, ways of measuring our development without our knowledge." He sat down. "Last night's signal is different. Last night's signal is the one that says, 'You made it.'" Sarah stared at the page. "HFY," she whispered, an old phrase her grandmother used to say when something changed everything, when the world before a moment and the world after it were simply not the same place. "From this point on, nothing is the same for me." Leo looked at her. "Yes," he said softly. "Exactly that." With 40 hours left in the response window, they called a meeting. All of them were exhausted. Sarah had not slept in 31 hours. James had a cut on his hand from where he had accidentally pressed down on a broken coffee mug without noticing. Marcus had not taken off his coat all day. Director Yates sat at the head of the table with her hands folded and her face perfectly composed. But Sarah had noticed that the director had read the French astronomer's diary entry 3 times during the course of the day and had not spoken for 20 minutes after the 3rd reading. "We have to vote," Marcus said. "This choice is not a democratic decision," Director Yates said immediately. "With respect," Marcus said, "I disagree. The people in this room are the first human beings in history to have complete information about what this signal is and what answering it means. If the decision belongs to anyone, it belongs to us." Director Yates looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the others. Then she unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table. "All right," she said. "Talk." James went first. He was the youngest, 29 years old, and he spoke with the kind of urgency that only comes from people who have not yet been taught to be afraid of being wrong. "We answer," he said. "We have to answer. We have been waiting our whole lives, the whole species has been waiting, for exactly this, to know we are not alone, to know that something out there sees us. We have the opportunity to venture into something greater than ourselves." He looked around the table. "If we stay silent, we are choosing fear over everything. And I refuse to believe that is who we are." Leo spoke next. He was quiet as always. "I want to answer," he said. "But I want to understand what we are answering with. What we say matters. How we say it matters. We have 72 hours and we have spent 12 of them reading. I suggest we spend the next 30 deciding not whether to answer but what to say." Marcus nodded slowly. "A fair point." Then everyone looked at Sarah. She had been staring at the table. Now she looked up. She thought about the French astronomer writing by candlelight in 1743. She thought about all the people who had carried this secret and never had the chance to speak. She thought about the signal pulsing in the speakers, low and rhythmic and patient, and the word Leo had translated as sacred and promising. "I think," she said carefully, "that we are afraid of the wrong thing." She paused. "We are afraid of what they might do if we answer. But we have not asked the more important question." She looked at Director Yates. "What happens to us, to who we are as a species, If we stay silent. If we choose, right now, knowing everything we know, to hide. She shook her head slowly. I think that silence would do more damage to us than anything they could ever do from out there. The room was quiet. Director Yates looked at her for a very long time. Then she said, Dr. Connell, are you aware that your position on this panel was not accidental? Sarah frowned. What do you mean? I mean, Director Yates said slowly, that when the council identified the signal was coming, 3 months ago, when the preliminary data first started showing patterns, we identified 6 people whose specific combination of skills and personal histories made them the ideal team to receive and respond to it. She paused. You were first on the list. Sarah felt something still inside her. Why? Director Yates opened a folder and slid a single page across the table. Because of your grandmother, she said. And what your grandmother left behind when she died. Sarah looked at the page. It was a photocopy of a handwritten letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her throat tightened. My grandmother died when I was 12, she said. Yes, said Director Yates. And 6 months before she died, she mailed this letter to an address in Geneva. An address that belongs to the council. She pointed at the page. Read the last paragraph. Sarah picked up the page. Her hands were steady. She read the last paragraph. Then she set it down. Then she pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. She knew, Sarah said. Her voice was hushed. My grandmother knew. She was one of us, Director Yates said gently. She chose not to tell you because she wanted you to find it yourself. She wanted it to be real for you, not inherited. Pause. She wrote in that letter, my granddaughter will be the one who answers. I know it the way I know my own name. Caro, let her find her own way there. Do not push her. She will arrive. Sarah sat very still for a long moment. Then she stood up. We answer, she said. And I will write the response myself. Nobody argued. Sarah took the next 18 hours and she wrote. She did not write alone. Leo sat beside her for most of it, helping translate the mathematical language framework that the archive described, the language the signal had been sent in and the language they would need to respond in. Marcus checked her work every few hours, quiet and careful. James brought food that nobody ate. Director Yates stayed in the building but gave Sarah space, sitting in a corner chair reading documents and occasionally looking up to watch Sarah work with an expression Sarah could not quite name. What Sarah wrote was not a declaration. It was not a greeting exactly. It was something harder to define. Something closer to an answer given by a person who has just been asked a question they have spent their entire life trying to understand. She wrote about what it meant to be human. Not the clean version. Not the version you put in a museum exhibit or a school textbook. The real version. The complicated version. The version included war, grief, cruelty, and the long dark stretches where it seemed the species might simply choose to destroy itself and be done with it. She wrote all of that. And then she wrote the other part. The part that kept surviving. The part that built hospitals and wrote symphonies and sat with dying strangers and planted trees it would never see grow tall and stood at the edge of the ocean and wept for reasons it could not name and kept, stubbornly, against all logic and every reason to stop, choosing to go on. She wrote about the French astronomer. She included the exact quote from his diary. I do not know whether they are kind or merely patient. She followed it with her line. We have decided to believe there is no difference. And so we answer. Leo encoded it all into the mathematical framework. The final message was translated into pure data form, approximately the length of a short novel. Is it too much? James asked, looking at the size of the file. No, Leo said simply. It is exactly right. They transmitted it with 31 hours still left in the response window. And then they waited. Sarah went to the window and stood looking out at the night sky, where the stars were obvious. She found herself thinking about her grandmother, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had lived alone in a house full of books and had always seemed to know things she should not have known, looking at Sarah sometimes with an expression that felt less like pride and more like recognition. Caro, Sarah thought, using her grandmother's word the way her grandmother had always used it, not as a command but as a kind of blessing, a release, a letting go. I did it, she thought. I found my way here. She stood at the window for a long time. Nobody spoke. The night was quiet. The signal had stopped playing on the speakers. They had turned it off when they sent the response, and the silence it left behind felt immense and clean, like the silence after the last note of a very long piece of music. Then, at 3:47 in the morning, something changed. It was Leo who noticed first. He made a sharp sound, not quite a word, and everyone turned to look at his screen. Sarah crossed the room fast, looked at the data, and felt the floor shift beneath her. That is not possible, Marcus said behind her. It is happening, Leo said. The response had come back. Not in hours, not in days, in minutes. As if whoever was out there had been sitting and waiting, had read every word Sarah wrote in the time it takes a person to draw a breath, and had already known exactly what to say back. Sarah leaned in close to the screen. What does it say? James asked. His voice cracked slightly. Leo was quiet for a moment. Then he turned around and Sarah saw that his eyes were wet. It says, Leo began, and then he stopped and pressed his lips together and collected himself. He tried again. It says, we have waited a very long time to hear you say that. Welcome, children of Earth. HFY, from this moment forward you are not alone. Nobody moved for a full minute. Sarah counted the seconds without meaning to. She heard James exhale slowly somewhere behind her. She heard the hum of the station's heating system. Furthermore, she heard from somewhere far outside, the sound of a car passing on an empty road. Ordinary sounds. The world outside this room was completely ordinary and had no idea that inside it, everything had just changed. Director Yates broke the silence. We need to go dark, she said, standing and moving to the communication console. Everything goes dark right now. No external transmissions, no. No, Sarah said. The word came out quietly, but it stopped Director Yates like a wall. Everyone stared at Sarah. She turned from the screen and looked at the director. No, she said again more calmly. We are not going dark. We are not hiding this. Not anymore. Dr. Connell? Director Yates. Sarah's voice was steady and she held the older woman's gaze without flinching. My grandmother spent decades carrying this secret. The people in that archive spent centuries carrying it. All those people, astronomers, soldiers, scientists, priests, all of them dying with it locked inside them. She shook her head slowly. The whole reason we were isolated, the whole reason this was hidden, was to protect humanity until we were ready. She looked at the screen at the words still glowing there. Welcome, children of Earth. We just proved we are ready. They said so themselves. She looked back at the director. It is over. The hiding is over. Director Yates looked at her for a long time. You understand, the director said quietly, what release means. The panic. The chaos. Governments destabilized. Religions. People are stronger than you think, James said from across the room. He was standing very straight. Give them the truth and they will find a way through it. Marcus said nothing. He was looking at Director Yates with something careful in his expression. Not pressure, just waiting. Director Yates looked at each of them in turn. Then she looked at the message on the screen. Then she sat back down in her chair and placed both hands on the table and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. My mother was on the council, she said quietly. It was unexpected. Nobody had asked. And her mother before her. 3 generations of my family have kept this. She paused. I used to think it was the most important thing we did. The protecting. The waiting. The managing of information. She stopped. Then, I think I may have been wrong. Silence. Not about the protecting, she said, but about what we were protecting them from. She looked at Sarah. We thought we were protecting them from the truth. But maybe what they needed protecting from was exactly this. The silence. She was quiet for a moment. The isolation. Sarah said nothing. She just waited. Director Yates reached into her coat and pulled out a phone. She placed it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked up at Sarah. You write the announcement, she said. I will make the calls. It took 72 hours. Telling everyone in less than 72 hours was impossible. But 72 hours for the information to move through the world's governments, through the major scientific bodies, through the media, and finally into the hands of the people. 72 hours from Director Yates making her calls to the moment a newscaster in Sao Paulo looked into a camera with shaking hands and said the words that would be replayed for generations. Sarah watched it from the station. They had not left. The station had become a kind of anchor, a center of something too large to name. Scientists were arriving from around the world now. Linguists, physicists, anthropologists, biologists, all of them coming to stand in the same room where the message had been received and the answer had been sent, as if the room itself had become sacred. The world's reaction was not what Director Yates had predicted. Or rather, there was fear, and there were people who said terrible things, and there were governments that stumbled, and there were voices that called it a lie and voices that called it the end and voices that called it everything in between. But underneath all of that, louder and stronger and more persistent than anything else, was something the director had not fully accounted for. Relief. The world felt relief. It moved across the planet like a wave, quiet and enormous. Billions of people who had spent their entire lives with a feeling they could not name, a loneliness so large and so old it had seeped into every religion, every myth, and every late-night conversation between people sitting under the stars, discovered all at once that the feeling was not irrational. It was not madness. It was not just the small private loneliness of a single life. It was the accurate perception of an accurate fact. The species had been alone. And now it was not. And somewhere in that understanding, something eased. Sarah saw it in the messages that started coming into the station's public communications channel. They had opened one for the first time in the station's history. The messages were from everyone: farmers, students, doctors, teenagers, grandparents, and children who could barely write. They came in every language. They said different things, but they said, underneath the different words, the same thing. Thank you for telling us. Sarah read them for hours. She read them until she could not see the screen clearly anymore and had to stop and press her hands against her face for a moment. Marcus found her like that. He put a hand on her shoulder. You should sleep, he said. I know, she said. Your grandmother would be. I know, she said again, softer. He squeezed her shoulder and walked away. Sarah lowered her hands. She looked at the screen full of messages. She thought about her grandmother's handwriting in that letter. My granddaughter will be the one who answers. She picked up her phone and called her mother. After 4 rings, her mother answered, and Sarah could immediately tell from her voice that she had been crying. Sarah, her mother said. Baby. Hi, Mom. A silence. The warm, full kind. She always said, her mother began. Then she stopped. Started again. She always said you were going to do something. Something big. Pause. I never asked her what she meant. I wish I had asked her. She meant this, Sarah said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? Her mother asked. Sarah looked at the messages on the screen. She looked at the window and the night sky beyond it. Yeah, she said. I really am. 3 weeks after first contact, the second message arrived. This one was longer. Much longer. Leo and a team of 40 linguists worked around the clock to translate it, and what they found inside it was something none of them had fully prepared for, not because it was frightening but because it was so deeply and completely human. It was a history. Not their history. Ours. The message contained records, detailed, precise, and in some cases astonishingly intimate records, of humanity's development across the last 2 million years. Not just the broad strokes. The actual events. Wars they had watched without intervening. Diseases that had nearly caused the species to become extinct. Moments of terrible violence and extraordinary beauty were all observed, recorded, and kept with a care and attention that, when you really sat with it, was almost unbearable. They had watched the first human hands make fire. They had watched the building of the first cities. They had been present, in some form, for every major turning point in human history, observing, recording, never interfering. The archive showed evidence of debates among them about whether to intervene during humanity's darkest periods. There had been arguments, disagreements, factions that wanted to step in during the worst years and factions that held firm to the principle of non-interference. The non-interference faction had won. Every time. Because of a belief, recorded carefully in the archive, that a species that was rescued too early would never fully develop its own strength. That the hardship, as terrible as it was part of the process. Humanity had to find its own way to kindness, or else kindness would not endure. Sarah read the passage and felt something complicated move through her. It was not quite anger, not quite gratitude. Something caught between the two. Leo seemed to feel the same way. He found her late one night reading the records. Does it bother you? He asked, sitting down beside her. Did they watch and not help? Yes, Sarah said honestly. And no. She thought for a moment. It bothers me how a parent's decision to let a child fail affects me. You understand the reasoning, but it does not make the child's pain smaller. Leo nodded slowly. But then I read this part, Sarah said, and pointed at a section of the translation. It was a record of an internal communication from among the observers, a message sent between 2 of them during the Second World War, when the body count was rising in ways that had apparently come close to triggering intervention. The message, translated as closely as possible, read, I know what we decided. I know why we decided it. But I want you to know that watching this unfold is the hardest thing I have ever done. These are not animals below. They are not even children. They are something I do not have a word for in our language. They are a force that shatters, mends, breaks again and never stops. I am recording this because I need someone to know that I see them. I want everyone to understand that this is not an easy task. That we are not cold. Sarah looked at Leo. They were not cold, she said. No, Leo agreed. They were not. 6 weeks after first contact they asked if they could come. The message was simple and direct. A formality almost as if they had been working up to it for a long time, which Sarah supposed they had. They asked if humanity was ready to receive visitors. They asked with the careful, formal courtesy of people who understand that stepping into someone else's home is a significant thing, no matter how long you have been watching through the window. The United Nations spent 2 weeks debating the answer. Sarah testified before 3 separate bodies. She told them what she had read. She told them about the non-interference principle. Furthermore, she told them about the message during the Second World War. She told them, very carefully, that everything she had seen in the archive suggested these were beings who had thought more deeply and more carefully about humanity's well-being than most humans ever had. She did not tell them it would be simple. She told them it would be the hardest and most important thing the species had ever done. She told them she believed they could do it. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The answer was yes. Sarah was in the station on the day they arrived. She had asked to be there and nobody had argued. Director Yates stood beside her. James stood on her other side. Leo was at the communication console. Marcus was outside, standing in the field behind the station with his hands in his pockets and his face turned up to the sky. There was no dramatic entrance. No beam of light. No sound. One moment the sky over the field was empty and the next moment it was not. A shape, large and quiet and absolutely still, hanging above the ground with a patience that felt, to Sarah, like the patience of something that had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. A door opened. Or something that functioned as a door. 3 figures came out. Sarah had spent weeks trying to prepare herself for this. She had told herself that whatever they looked like, she would not flinch. She had told herself she was ready. She was ready. They were tall, significantly taller than any human. Their proportions were slightly different in ways that were hard to immediately process. Their faces were, and this was the thing Sarah had not prepared for, the thing that made something in her chest crack open like a window being thrown wide. Their faces were not so different from her own. Not human. But not alien in the cold, clinical way the word implied. They looked like something that had grown in a universe adjacent to this one, something that had arrived at intelligence and emotion through a different door but had arrived at the same room. The one in the center looked at Sarah. Then it spoke, not in English, not in any human language. But the words came through a small device on its collar, translated with a slight delay. Dr. Sarah Connell, it said. We have been looking forward to this for a very long time. Sarah looked at it for a moment. Then she said, so have we. We just did not know it. Something moved across its face. It was not a human expression. But Sarah understood it anyway, the way you understand music in a language you have never learned. It was a smile. 3 months into what the world was now calling the first contact period, Leo made the final discovery. He had been working late, as he always did now, as all of them did now, because the archive was enormous and every section of it contained something that rewrote something else they thought they knew. He was in the deeper files, the oldest ones, the ones that had required 3 separate decryption keys and 2 additional translators just to access. He called Sarah at 2 in the morning. Come to the station, he said. No greeting. No preamble. Leo? Please, he said. Now. She came. He was sitting at his workstation with his coat still on and his hands perfectly still in his lap, which was unusual for Leo, who was always moving, always adjusting, always thinking with his hands. He was very still in the way that people are still when the ground has dropped away beneath them and they are not yet sure they are done falling. He looked at her when she walked in. Sit down, he said. She sat. What I am about to tell you, he said, is the thing they kept hidden longest. Not from us, from themselves almost. It is buried in the oldest section of the archive, the records from before any living member of their species was born. He paused. Sarah. The reason they began watching Earth. The reason they found us. The reason, out of billions of star systems, this one was marked. Another pause. It was not random. It was not a survey. It was not scientific curiosity. Sarah waited. They were looking for something specific, Leo said. Something they had lost. He turned to his screen and brought up a section of translated text. Sarah leaned in and read it. She read it once. Then she read it again. That is not possible, she said very quietly. I know, Leo said. She sat back. Her mind was moving very fast and very quietly, the way it did when she was working through something that would not quite resolve, like a lens not quite in focus, and then suddenly it was. They evolved here, she said. Leo nodded once. On Earth, she said. Not humans. Not our ancestors. but the original seed, the first spark of what eventually became them. 3 billion years ago, before the planet fully formed, before life had taken any shape we would recognize, a catastrophic event scattered biological material across this part of the galaxy. He pointed at the screen. They developed from that material. On another world in another star system. They became what they are over billions of years. He looked at her. But the origin point, the first and oldest root of what they are, is here. This planet. He paused. Earth is not just a place they have been watching. It is home, Sarah said. It is home, Leo said. And we, all of us, every human being alive, we are what the planet made when it had another chance. We are, he said slowly, something like cousins. Something like an echo. Something that grew from the same source into an entirely different shape. He was quiet for a moment. They did not interfere because they could not. Not without compromising something they consider sacred. He tapped the screen. The document calls it, the translation is imperfect but it reads as, the right of the second growth. The right to life comes after finding its form. To not be shaped by what came before. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the message. Welcome, children of Earth. She had thought it was poetic. A figure of speech. They meant it literally, she said. Yes, Leo said. They are not visitors. They are not strangers. They are, he stopped. Tried again. They came back, he said simply. After 3 billion years they came back to see what their home had made. Sarah stood outside the station the next morning at dawn. The sky was clear and cold, and the stars were still faintly visible in the gray-blue light before the sun came up. She had not slept. She had spent the night sitting with what Leo had found, turning it over and over in her mind, not trying to resolve it, just letting it settle. Letting it become real the way big things have to become real, slowly like water finding its level. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind her and turned. It was the tall one, the one from the ship, the one who had spoken her name first. They had been named by the translation team, Commander Ain. It was not their actual name was not pronounceable by any human throat, but it was close enough in meaning that they had accepted it without objection. Ain walked toward her and stopped a few feet away. They looked at the sky together. You know, Sarah said without turning. Leo found the oldest archive. Yes, Ain said. The device on their collar translated the word with a slight warmth in the tone. We were wondering how long it would take. You knew we would find it. We hoped. Pause. We left the decryption keys in a place where your particular kind of mind would eventually look. It was not something we could simply tell you. It needed to be discovered. Pause. The way all true things need to be discovered. Sarah looked at the sky. The sun was beginning to edge up over the horizon, the first faint line of gold appearing at the edge of the world. 3 billion years, she said. Yes. You came all this way. You waited all this time. She paused. And when you got here you found us. Yes, Ain said. Something moved in the translated voice, something that was neither quite a word nor quite a sound, something the device rendered simply as a pause, but that Sarah heard as the equivalent of a person pressing their hand against their chest. What did you think? She asked. When you first saw what we had become? Ain was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not absence but preparation. There is a word in our language, they said finally. It has no precise translation. It describes the feeling of returning to a place you have not been for so long that you no longer expected to recognize it, and finding that despite everything, despite all the time and the change, something essential remains. Something you remember. Something that knows you back. Pause. When we first watched your species, not the surveys, the first true observation, when we understood what you were, that is the word we used. Sarah let that sit. We are not what you were, she said. We grew differently. Yes, Ain agreed. You grew differently. You grew harder in some ways, more fragile in others. You carry pain in ways we no longer do, or perhaps never learned to. Your history is full of things we would have done differently. Pause. But you also grew into things we did not anticipate. Things we do not have. The French astronomer who wrote about patience and love. The words were exact, they had read the archive too, all of it. The woman who wrote a response to a first contact signal and included grief and war and forgiveness because she believed those things deserved to be known. Pause. We have lived billions of years and crossed the galaxy and we did not know how to do that. We did not know, Ain said quietly, how to be that honest about our own darkness. Sarah felt something move through her that she did not have a word for. Something that was loss and pride and sorrow and recognition all folded into one feeling too large for language. Leo says we are cousins, she said. Cousins, Ain agreed. It is a good word. The sun came fully over the horizon. The gold light spread across the field and caught the edge of the ship still hovering in the distance, and for a moment it looked less like a machine and more like something alive, something that had traveled a very long road to be exactly here in this light at this moment. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now, Ain said, we begin. Begin what? Everything, they said simply. Everything that becomes possible when two things that grew from the same root finally find each other again. Pause. We have technology you have not imagined. You have courage and creativity, and you feel something we lost so long ago, of which we have no record. Together, they stopped. Started again. Together, there is nothing in the universe that is unreachable. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She looked at the sky, the wide open morning sky, full of light now, all the stars gone pale in the rising sun. She thought about her grandmother. About the letter. About a small, sharp-eyed woman who had known all of it and had lived her whole life quietly, carrying a secret as large as the galaxy, and had planted it, like a seed, like a beginning, in the only place she trusted. In her granddaughter. Sarah thought. You were right. I found my way. She turned to look at Ain, this tall, ancient, patient being standing in the gold morning light of a planet that was, in the oldest and deepest sense of the word, as much their home as it was hers. HFY, she said softly. The phrase her grandmother had used. The phrase Leo had translated from the first message. From this moment forward, nothing is the same. Ain was still for a moment. Then they turned to look at her. And in the tone that came through the translation device, past all the technology, past all the distances of time and species and stars, Sarah heard something unmistakable. Ain had understood. Not the words. The meaning beneath the words. The human thing inside the sound. Yes, Ain said. Warmly. Completely. HFY, they repeated. From this moment forward. Sarah looked at the sky one more time. All that open, endless, living sky. Then she turned back toward the station, toward Leo and Marcus and James and Director Yates and all the work that waited, the beautiful, enormous, impossible work of beginning, and she walked forward into the morning. Globe showing Europe, Africa, the end.